We're on now. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We'll just wait a few minutes to have everyone have a chance to log in and join us before we get started. Alrighty, there's still some people joining, but I'll just get started with the introduction. So hello and welcome on behalf of the Book and Paper Group, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on today's lecture, which is on the topic of shagreen. Just a few bits of housekeeping before we get started. If you want to join us on social media, we're using the hashtag #ConservationTogetherAtHome, and I'll just pop that in the chat box once we get going, so you can use it if you want to. As I'm sure you all know by now, we're all using our home internet, so please do be patient if there's any technical issues. If there is anything that does happen, like the webinar cuts out, you can rejoin at the same link and we'll get going as quick as possible, though I'm sure it'll all go well today. The video is being recorded, so if you miss any reference, not to worry, it'll be posted up as soon as possible after the talk. And then we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end, but if you have any questions during the talk, please do pop them in the Q&A window, which is at the bottom of the screen at any time, and we can have them ready for the end of the talk. So I'm just going to introduce our speaker today. Herre de Vries is the co-owner of the Amsterdam-based conservation studio Restauratie Nijhoff Acer. He holds a higher professional degree from 2007 and an MSc from 2017 in book and paper conservation. He started his career in 1999 working as a bookbinder and has since mostly worked in private practice. And in 2012, he worked at the Vatican Library on the conservation of Islamic manuscripts. All right, so I'm going to unmute Herre and pass him over to you for the presentation.
Thank you very much. I think I am now unmuted and everyone can hear me. Welcome to all around the globe joining us for this session today. Thank you for joining, and I hope to clarify many things about shagreen, and particularly the type of shagreen one can find on book bindings. So a few years ago when I was doing my master thesis, I looked at the shagreen we find on book bindings, and I found it to be a rather confusing material that can sometimes look much more like leather or more like parchment. And then I wondered, like, how can we really identify this material? What really is it, and which production methods, or how was it made? So that's what I wanted to answer. This talk I gave 2 years ago at the British Library, but yeah, we're 2 years further on, and I will include a few new things. Now the only thing what isn't happening is then my slide is actually moving now. Thank you. So what we will be talking about, I will introduce the shagreen bindings the way I know them from Dutch collections. I think they should be in collections around the world, but they seem to be a bit of a Dutch phenomenon, or at least there's is mostly the Netherlands where there has been attention for these bindings. So I will introduce the bindings, and then we'll have a look at what is written about the material, the shagreen material on book bindings in both modern literature and in historical literature. and some of the historical literature which discusses the production methods. I will illustrate with some imagery of me trying to reconstruct the material. So I actually got some hides and worked on them and to see how, to understand what these writers were actually saying. And then the second part of the presentation will actually go into the proper research I did. We'll look at the bindings, how I assessed the bindings, what results I got from that assessment, the visual assessment with my naked eye. And then we will go to see, have a look at the cross sections of all the shagreen on those book bindings that I looked at visually, and we will identify, or at least try and identify, what material we are looking at. And then we'll put the two types of results together, so the macroscopical visual observations and the microscopical identification, and see what that can actually tell us about the material that we find around book bindings and that we generally tend to call shagreen. So what we are looking at is, like, we're looking at those type of bindings. Mostly they're completely black, with very little tooling, some silver clasps and furniture, and so that's quite basic, like the first appearance. The silver obviously gives it a big sense of luxury. And mostly the contents of these bindings, it's very limited. It's mostly like Bibles or psalm books on the one hand, and then you'll find the almanacs. They are mostly rather small. So here in my hand, I'm holding a little almanac in shagreen. So that's just to give you an impression, it's rather small. This is a little prayer book in shagreen, so it's slightly bigger. So you will find occasionally a quarto size, but mostly the books are much smaller. On this, if you have been counting already on this image, you will see that there's 1, 2, 4, 6, and 8 sewing supports. Whether there is actually 8 sewing supports, so they're pretending there to be 8, at least they're sort of showing some sort of richness. So you will always see these shagreen bindings supposedly at least having a lot of sewing supports. And on the inside, you will find that the cores of the boards are mostly made of scale board, or almost always, really. They will have gilt edges, sometimes goffered edges. As I said, a very simple blind tooling, mostly a little, a sort of square around the outer edge of the boards and a few lines along the sewing supports. And then obviously most or a lot of them are finished with silver clasps or silver furniture as well. So that is sort of the structure of the book. Then when we go back to the outside of the book and we actually look at the shagreen, we see that the shagreen surface can have different appearances. So at the beginning, the first slide, you saw a detail of shagreen which had like a very irregular surface. It's all a granular pebbled surface, but some of them are completely irregular. And then you have those that have a very regular fan shape, like the one on the right here. And this is again is a detail of such an irregular pattern. This binding is interesting because it has gold tooling, which is very exceptional. This is the only one I've seen in my research. I've looked at 85 bindings, but during my, that I used actually for the research, but I looked at many more and I didn't see any other one with gold tooling. So it's mostly really blind tooling, if there is any tooling at all. Well, there we look at the fan shape again. So these are the main, the main differences. You either have an irregular pattern or you have this typical fan shape pattern. So we are looking at books roughly datable to the period of 1600 to about 1900. And then after 1900, there might sorry, sometimes be books covered in something that looks like shagreen, but it's sort of like dying off. In the international book trade, it has also been called shark skin at times. Well, it really isn't shark skin, because shark skin, like the ray skin you see below, it has actual denticles. So you actually have sort of teeth in the hide, and these teeth are definitely not present on the bindings that we see, which are covered in shagreen. And I would also really stop using the word shark skin. It is really shagreen, and shagreen can indeed be shark skin and ray skin, but it can also be something else, and there's a historical reason why it can be something else, and I hope to show that to you in the next, in this presentation. As I said, I noticed when I was working with these bindings, very often they have very diverse properties. Sometimes they feel more like slightly soft leather. You see a flake and grain layer, and some other times the binding doesn't open. It's cracked at the joint the way a parchment binding would crack, with a very clean crack. You see a very light fiber mass underneath the black surface. But because the surface is hidden, or the actual material is hidden underneath that granular surface, it's not really easy to identify it, and nobody really knows. Nobody really knew for sure what it was. So that brought me to the question: is all these things that we see with the naked eye, and actually that we feel as well when we touch the bindings and when we use them, and for the conservators amongst us, when we work on them, these visual properties, would they be sufficient for us to understand that we are actually working with either a more parchment-like material or a type of shagreen which is more like leather-like? Because it slightly sort of changes the way you approach the material, what you expect to be able to do with the object and with the material, and what you expect you can't do or shouldn't do. So what I wanted to do is to relate those macroscopical observations and relate those to proper microscopical identification of the material. How exactly, I will leave for now, and why I chose this method, I will introduce it later on in the presentation. But by looking at the cross sections, you're able to distinguish between leather and parchment. So this is what I wanted to do, and to relate those results to what I've seen on the bindings. Then the first thing to do, obviously, and which I had already done when I was preparing the introduction I just gave, is look at modern literature. And then we see there's, I think, 3 key publications. A lot of it, shagreen is mentioned very often, but the type of shagreen that is also found on book bindings, it is mentioned, I think, by 3 key authors. 2 of them, the top 2, Idelette van Leeuwen and Jutta Gutfried, they are both conservators, professional conservators, one working at the German Leather Museum, the Deutsches Ledermuseum, and one working here at the Rijksmuseum. And then the third one, Mathieu Willemsen, is a curator of the military museums here in the Netherlands, and he wrote a lot about shagreen, so I think he deserves definitely a mention. He's not so, professionally, he's not so involved with the material in a material way, the way conservators are. So from a material point of view, I would definitely count the top 2 as the best publications on, so far. And basically what they say is about the properties of the material is they testify that, it has a certain elasticity when it's wet. It tends to shrink a lot upon drying. When you see it on objects, you can actually sometimes think it's a parchment, and sometimes you think it's a leather. And then Mathieu Willemsen, he very much wants to distinguish between shagreen, as in the ray skin, and the shark skin, which you find on many objects as well, and the stuff that is used on book bindings, which is not ray and shark skin, he says, but we should call it shagreen leather. Well, I understand why he wants to make this distinguish. He wants to distinguish these 2, but I think shagreen leather is very problematic because, as I will show in this presentation, what we find on book bindings can also be a parchment type of material. But none of these authors had a more thorough look at the material than just this sort of visual assessment and the actual working and the experiences they had working with the material. So I wanted to look for a way how to identify it. So that's really what I was aiming for. What is this material? Is it sometimes parchment? Is it sometimes leather? And all these authors, they also mentioned historical sources, so that has been very useful. And then I found a lot of historical sources myself, references to the material, short references, longer ones. I will not mention all of them here, but some of them, they are quite thorough. They discuss how it was produced, the shagreen. That's mostly done by either, travelers or scientists who got their information from travelers, and they wrote it down from the late 17th century onwards. I will use some of those descriptions when, or I have used some of those descriptions to actually try and reconstruct shagreen. So I will use the pictures of those reconstructions to sort of illustrate that part of the historical literature. Then another part, which I think nobody had really looked at, another type of literature that we can use, are obviously all the descriptions of the bookbinding trade. Where do they mention covering books in shagreen, and what do they describe? How do they do it? And what can we, what can we understand reading those descriptions about what type of material it must have been that they were working with? And finally, it's a very, there's not a lot of photographs of shagreen makers, but at least there is one series of 6 photographs, which I thought was absolutely great. And it was online for a long time already, but apparently it had gone unnoticed a little bit. So I think I was the first one combining those pictures with the bigger story. So I will share a few of those pictures with you later on as well. So the historical literature, I think, when we discussed the production of the material, I would say there are 3 key publications. The oldest one being this publication from 1694 by the so-called royal pharmacist, or the pharmacist to Louis XIV of France, and he makes a general descriptions of the plants and the drugs you can make from plants and animals, and so he also describes donkeys. And when he describes donkeys, he discusses the production of shagreen, and he says it's made from donkey hides, from the butt region of the donkey hide. Seeds are pressed into the grain to get the shagreen surface, and he actually calls it a Marocain So that's what he says is the real shagreen, but he warns people that there's another type of shagreen available, which he calls a Marocain passé en chagrin. So he actually says there's a type of, I would say, goat leather that has been treated in such a way, surface treated in such a way that it should pass for shagreen, but it is not a real thing. He says the grain is much more susceptible to damage and flaking. So already in the 17th century, apparently there are 2 types of shagreen available, 2 different origins. This same information is repeated a few years later by Michel Bernard Valentini, who writes a much longer story about the production of shagreen, and he actually goes into several steps of how it was produced. He says it's not only produced with donkey hides, but any equine hide, so also horse hides, mule hides. He also says it's only the butt region that apparently is suitable to do it. There's seeds pressed into the grain of the hide, and he also warns for an imitation shagreen, which doesn't apparently possess the same quality as the, let's say, real shagreen, and he calls it corduan. And I think he really refers to pommet. So corduan would be the German translation for Marocain. So I would say we're thinking about he's mentioning a type of goat leather here. He also offers us the first imagery of the production of shagreen. So there's a little donkey to the left, and then he says the hides or the butt region are sort of stretched and tensioned in the ground and stuck in the ground with poles, and then the outer edge remains uncovered, but most of the surface of the hide on the grain sides get covered with the seeds. I very much doubt, of course, whether it would be covered in such a nice heart shape, which I think is quite lovely, but I don't think it's very close to reality. But it's a detail that I would, I don't mind pointing out to you. I think it's nice, a little hard in these times. A lot of what Michel Bernard Valentini says is repeated also later on in the 18th century, in 1781, by Peter Simon Pallas. Pallas was contracted by the wife of the Tsar to start working for the Russian Academy of the Sciences, and because of his work, he traveled the Russian Empire extensively, and he saw shagreen makers working in the Volga Delta, in Astrakhan. And so he described what he has seen there and how they work their skins. So I mainly use this description to to try and reconstruct shagreen, or at least to understand what these steps were doing and how this process was actually creating that sort of material with its pebbled surface. So I got a few horse hides, proper horse hides, and I had to dispose of most of the hide. As in a lot of historical sources, it also says for shagreen you only use the butt region, and some historical sources say that the rest of the skin is only fit for making glue, which I didn't do, unfortunately. Maybe I would have got some really good hot glue, hide glue. So you start out a process which is, you know, the same as when you're producing leather or parchment. You're soaking the skins, getting rid of the hairs, getting rid of the grease and the flesh remains on the inside of the hide. And once it's completely cleaned, it's being tensioned. And Pallas describes it's not being tensioned in the ground the way Valentini did, or describes it, but it's actually, you know, the butt region is cut out of the skin, and the butt region has a sort of crescent-like shape, a semicircle. And so they tension it in semicircle frames by pulling a rope or a piece of cord through holes in the outside of the skin. So that's what I try to replicate here. Then the grain side is up, and you cover the grain side with seeds. And the most commonly mentioned seed is that of the white goosefoot, the Chenopodium album, which is a very tiny seed. And it's being spread out all over the surface until the surface is fully covered, which looks a little bit like this. Then it's described that the seeds are being covered by some part of cloth or a felt, and then they are using their feet. They are pushed into the grain of into the grain of the hide. And once that's done, so this is after I've pushed the seeds into the skin, into the hide. The hide is left to dry, and then once the hide is dry, you actually get a sort of parchment-like material. So here you see a change of color, but it's not only a parchment-like material, it's a material with little recesses at the place where all these seeds were. So these seeds, they have locally compressed the hide. And then the next step is to scrape that hide the way it is in this condition, and then scrape it until it's nearly smooth again. But you have to be cautious not to scrape away the bottom of these recesses. After that has been done, so you see me using just a regular paint scraper, sort of scraping the surface of it's really a parchment material here because of the tensioning. It's been dried under tension, so you feel it's like stiff and hard. So I'm scraping it here until those little white spots, which is like the sort of dust that collects in the recesses, until these white spots become very small. And then you know you're reaching sort of the point where you start to scrape also the bottom of the recesses. So that's what I've done. And then the next step would be to soak the skins in water for I think they say about 24 hours. And then really the magic happens, because this process is a process of sort of inversion. So first you use the seeds to make the recesses, but then you don't have the pebbled surface. So you need to create the pebbled surface, and that's what happens, the combined action of the scraping and the soaking. And then you see that once you start soaking the skins, those bottoms of the recesses where there's more collagen, more hide material, start swelling, and they rise above the surface of the hide. So that's actually when you get the pebbles, and that's exactly what is being described in those historical texts. The only thing is, if you leave the hide to dry like this, I have noticed, then it sort of collapses. So you need to do something to conserve this state, to conserve these elevated parts of collagen. And one of the ways they describe is to cover it with a sort of paste of flour with alum. So it's basically it's like alum thawing the parchment, I would say. So that's one way, and the other way is to just cover it with gallnut powder. So actually you're tanning the surface of the material. I found the second way of doing it, so using the gallnut, much easier actually, because it really sort of tans the surface, and it is, you at least get some, you know, some of those little pebbles that have, you know, risen above the surface when you were soaking the skin. They actually stay well. I didn't manage to work to get a successful result, or something close to a successful result, with the sort of alum paste. Here you see that the water, the humidity from the skin is actually taken into the gallnut powder. You also see that there's a very strong reaction on the outsides of the skin. That's because of some of the lye I used when I was soaking the skin to get it, to prepare it for dehairing. Apparently, some of it is still in the grain of the hide, and that responds quite heavily. That reacts quite heavily with the gallnuts. The final step, the final two steps actually would then be to first put grease or a fat to the skin, which is they say it's a sheep fat, so it's more of a tallow than a lanolin, I'd suppose. And they just, you know, they heat it until it's liquid, and they just pour it out on the skin, and I think then they would polish the skins until they are nice and shiny. And it's only then that they actually give the skins a color, which can be they can either keep them white, so with the alum tawed ones they would just keep white, or they give them a red or a blue or a green color. And the ones we see on the book bindings are mostly, well, they're really always black, and they give that black color to the shagreen hides, which actually were not alum tawed, but which were tanned with the gallnut powder, and then they add iron vitriol or iron sulfate to the surface of the skin, and you get this iron galling reaction, and the skin turns dark blue, blackish. So that's what I'm doing here. So this is the best result I got with the alum tanning. So it's nowhere near what we can see on those beautiful bindings. I clearly lack the skill of those old shagreen makers, but you see that in essence, this process of inversion, it is possible. It should be possible. So that was important for me, because some of the other authors, they had also been wondering, like these 18th century descriptions, are they correct? What are they exactly describing? You know, you sometimes see people referring to them in blogs, and then they don't understand that it's really a process of inversion and not only the fact of pressing the seeds in. So yeah, that's that much for the reconstruction and the production of shagreen. Then another important source I found to understand what kind of material we're looking at when we're looking at shagreen on book bindings are those descriptions of the bookbinding trade, sometimes written by bookbinders, sometimes written by scholars who studied who visited bookbinders, who talked to them, who studied what they were doing, and they wrote it down. And then I found the earliest mention of shagreen used on bookbindings in a bookbinding treatise. This is from 1704. It's an unpublished manuscript by Jacques Jourgenn, who, as part of the series of the trades published for the Académie des Sciences in France in the 18th century, prepared a publication about bookbinders. I will tell a little bit about the contents of these authors later, but I will just introduce them now quickly. So, and then another important one is a German manual from Christoph Ernst Prediger, I think well known to a lot of you who are familiar with bookbinding manuals. So that's midway 18th century. Then it is René Martin Dudin, which actually publishes then a description of the bookbinding trade for the Académie des Sciences in France in 1772. And part of his work is based on that work by Jacques Jourgenn. And then I think the last one that I find quite important is for a thorough understanding of shagreen is Hendrik de Haas's The Bookbinder, the bookbinder, a Dutch bookbinder who published his description of his own work, because he was properly a bookbinder himself in 1806. So when we look at what they describe many things, and I will not tell you all, but it is very important to see that Jacques Chirurgion again says that the shagreen you use for covering bindings is actually donkey butt. And it is being sold in Paris, so people could go to shops and buy the shagreen apparently, and it's either sold with a gray color or what he calls natural. And he says when you use it, you cut off the outer edge, let's say the ungrained edge, which hasn't been treated. So that sort of reminds you of that image on the right that comes from the publication by Michael Bernard Valentini, where you actually see that the seeds are not covering the outer edges of the skins. Also because these outer edges are used to tension the skins. Then he is also warning when you are actually covering the bindings with shagreen not to pull the material too much, because it might shrink back and pull the boards from their shoulder actually, and the boards might be drawn over the shoulder onto, well, more or less onto the spine. And then he finishes off saying that the bookbinders themselves, they color the shagreen with a regular ink. So I would suppose that would be a iron gall ink, and then you get a black material. Prediger says a lot of the same things. He also says before you start using the shagreen, you need to soak it in water. It needs to be completely soaked with water because otherwise it's too stiff. He says, I use a hot glue to actually adhere it to the bindings. I know some binders, they used a paste, but I consider it's not strong enough. And he also warns that there's a good type of shagreen and a bad type of shagreen, and that bad type of shagreen apparently comes from Schaffhausen in Switzerland. I don't know why. I haven't found any relationship with some sort of shagreen production in Schaffhausen or trade particularly, but maybe it's just very particular for Prediger's experience that he bought some shagreen, supposed shagreen there, which he found of very bad quality. And we have two more authors to go, René Martin Dudin. Interestingly, he repeats some of the stuff that we have already mentioned, but he also says that if you think you need to you need to make the shagreen thinner than the thickness it has when you buy it. So you make it as thin as possible, he says, but you go to a parchment maker to have it made thinner. So I suppose it is because it's more like a parchment material that you actually need to scrape much more than the way you would treat a leather, a piece of leather. And he also again emphasizes to soak the material in water prior to using it. Then our little or big Dutch friend Hendrik de Haas, he repeats many of those things that we have already said. He also emphasizes the use of hot glue and not paste. And then he uses the Dutch words. When he describes shagreen and shagreen bindings, he uses two Dutch words. And one is segrijnen, where you clearly see this means shagreen or segrijn. And then he mentions Spaans leren. And those Spaans leren sort of caught my attention, and I didn't know what to think of it until during my research, I actually came across a folder of a former Dutch bookbindery with, they had massive folders with big embossing plates. And on one of those folders it said Spaans leer, and that embossing plate actually was a shagreen plate with the fan shape that we have seen before. Luckily, recently, because I would love to experiment with such a thing, but these plates are in the National Library of the Netherlands. So yeah, there's no way of taking them home and having a go. Last year I managed to buy this little crate full of plates, and several of these plates have a shagreen surface. So it's all these brass plates, and some of them with this type of fan-shaped surface. And obviously I really wanted to have a go, so I had a go and I pressed it. And that's the whole skin, and that's the detail of the surface. So you see that those type of embossing plates, which are sometimes mentioned in historical sources also, but they're not much is explained of how they were used and how they were produced, whether they were only used, for instance, in wet leather, or whether they were actually pressed in there, heated and pressed into the leather. There's also mention of, instead of using plates, using rolls. I only found one mention saying that they were actually using the plates not only to emboss leather, but also to emboss parchment. So that's what I wanted to tell you about the historical, the bookbinding treatises. And then the final thing that I wanted to share with you before continuing and to actually look at the bindings and the research I did on those 85 bindings that I looked at are the pictures of the so-called Turkestan album. So in the 1860s, Russia conquered a part of modern-day Turkmenistan called Turkestan, and the consul or the governor of Turkestan ordered commissioned an album of all trades, of all costumes of that area, of that region. And in these 6 volumes, I think it's a total of 6 volumes, and I think there's only 5 copies or 4 copies around the world. One of them is in the Library of Congress, and that one has been published online. There are 6 photographs of shagreen makers. So here we see the 2 shagreen makers from Turkestan. And actually what we see here is really, really nice, because it is a perfect illustration of what Peter Simon Pallas wrote in 1781. So he says that they sort of cut out these semicircle shapes from the butt region of either horse or donkey or mule, and they tension them in semicircle frames by pulling a rope through holes in the outer edges of the skin. Then they cover the skin with seeds, they lay it down on the ground and stamp the seeds into the hide. So you actually see the 2 men, or the boy and a man, standing on top of such a skin which has been covered in seeds. A very nice detail is that at the lower right bottom you see a little sieve which is put up against the frame. And indeed, Pallas mentions that when they take off the seeds at the end of the production, they put the seeds through a sieve to get rid of all the debris so they can reuse the seeds. This is another one of the pictures, the last one I will show you, which here you see a man with a sharp iron scraping the surface of the shagreen. So that's actually the step after, when they're removing the seeds, and they're sort of scraping off the surface until they get close to the bottom of the recesses. A nice detail here is that you see it's on a wooden board, and that wooden board is covered with something, and then the skin is hooked through a little pin at the high end. I don't know if you see my cursor, there's a little pin here, so that the skin is hanging in there, and then there's the weights on both sides of the skin. And that's also what Pallas describes, is that they actually use that weight so the skin doesn't start moving by itself when they're scraping it, and they can actually sort of move, change the position of the skin themselves manually instead of the skin moving on its own. I was absolutely amazed when I saw these pictures. I was so happy. Just a Google session one afternoon, and it changed my shagreen life. So what we have seen now is that actually, and what I found in literature, I think I would conclude that shagreen is definitely the most used name. So there's a lot of other words that have come into use, but shagreen is just the name, the word they use for this material that we find on bookbindings. And indeed, it is not ray skin or it is not shark skin, but that doesn't mean that we are not allowed to call it shagreen. I think there's a very strong historical reason to call it shagreen, and I would say we keep calling it shagreen, and then we can always add an explanation to say which type of shagreen we exactly mean. So for bookbindings, that can be the type of shagreen from actually 2 origins, either an equine origin from the Caspian Sea region. So I think many of the countries, so the Volga Delta is on the Caspian Sea, Iran, supposedly it was made in Iran, in Isfahan, so that's also close to the Caspian Sea, and then Turkestan is also on the Caspian Sea. So I would say that would be the area of the world where they produced the shagreen. And then apparently, from a very early moment on, already in the 17th century in Europe, they were sort of imitating the shagreen in what I would say is reading the sources, a goat leather mostly. Although I found one reference that they are actually using parchment to, to establish that shagreen grain in a parchment instead of in a goat leather. So that first process from the Caspian Sea region that has been quite well documented by a few authors, whereas the use of the embossing plates or the rolls, I have not found, clear explanations of how it was used and how that process was done. And the first mentions of that process I only find in the late 18th century, whereas the first mention of the actual existence of these imitation shagreens in goat leather is already dating back to the late 17th century. So there's about, let's say, 100-year gap between the actual, between those two things, the actual description of the process and the fact that that apparently that process was there somewhere, somehow. And an important thing to understand is that I think in the bookbinding treatises, they describe a lot of properties that I would consider, that I would associate with parchment, a stiff material that you need to soak long, you prefer to use a hot glue to actually adhere it and not to paste, so you want some initial tack apparently, so maybe it doesn't change, even though it's elastic, it doesn't want to, stick to its material that easily. Also this thing of not stretch it, the warning to not stretch it too much, because then the boards will be pulled from their shoulder. Those are really things that I associate with a sort of parchment-like material. So that's the first part of the research, is what is being said about the material and what do I know from my daily practice. And then I had a look at, as I said, 85 book bindings from 2 collections here in the Netherlands. One from the National Library of the Netherlands, the Koninklijke Bibliotheek in The Hague, and another one from the Herre Livraria Montesinos, which is here in Amsterdam. It's the world's oldest Jewish library, which is also still functioning as a library. I looked at those 85 bindings. I looked at many aspects initially, but I sort of focused on 3 aspects, which were characterizing the fiber mass, looking at the color of the cross section of the material. So below that mostly black surface, what do I see, what kind of color, and whether or not there was a flaking upper layer. And I say upper layer because I'm not really sure if we're looking at a grain as in the grain layer of a hide, or just an artificial grain. The characterizing of the fiber mass, as you can see, I wanted to characterize either initially between smooth and compact on the one end, and fibrous and sort of sometimes more furry on the other end. So then on the smooth, compact end, there would be parchment, and then the fibrous one would be leather. But I found that when looking at it, I was sometimes very much in doubt. So I added these 2 categories with question marks, which doesn't make it look very scientific, but I think it is very honest and important to be honest, because our observations are obviously also a personal thing based on experience, and it's not an exact science. Then the second characteristics is the color of the cross section. So again, we go from parchment on the left to more leather on the right, so changing from a light and gray cross section to a brown and even dark red brown cross section. And then I would think that the presence of a flaking layer can tell us something. If there is no flaking of an upper layer, it can either be a very good leather, or it can be a parchment of which a shagreen which was scraped on the grain side. Remember, the seeds were pressed into the grain sides, and then the grain side was scraped, so the grain layer in shagreen is not intact, so you wouldn't have it flaking the way it would flake with a proper leather. So I would also say no is either parchment, a shagreen-like parchment, parchment-like shagreen, or it is just a very good leather. And yes, it is definitely a leather type of shagreen with a natural grain layer present. We will not, don't worry, we will not look at all 85 bindings, although I would love to look at it with you, but I will show a few pictures of what I looked at and how problematic it can really be, because sometimes you have very little to go by to establish these three characteristics. So for instance, here you have a binding which is still, in quite a good condition. And then at one of the end caps, you see it's been damaged, and it sort of is light. It has a light color. I would say it's a light gray color still. Maybe this is the picture tending towards brown, but I remember it feeling very hard, so I was tempted to say it's parchment, but I do see that the fiber structure, there's a little fiber sticking out. It's a little bit rough. It's not as compact as I would think it should be for a parchment. So this is one, for instance, that I had trouble saying that it was really smooth. So this was a smooth with a question mark. And the same here. This is a very hard, very compact shagreen, but there's a little bit of damage on the tail end. This fiber mass is quite compact, and I think I've called it smooth, but because of the sort of red-brown color, you're very tempted to see something else. So this is not this is really meant to show you how difficult it can sometimes really be to sort of assess these properties. And here is it's the color of the cross section. So you have these little cracks at the turn-ins to which you can at which you can look, and then you see there's a very dark upper layer. There's some white underneath, and in this case, I was sure that this was not a paper with which the material was lined. So then you can say, okay, this is the color beneath the surface is actually a light color. This is what I would call a brown, so it's quite reddish already, and then you have the really red brown. So this is not exactly, just to emphasize it again, but I do think that we'll get, you feel what we're going for. And here, this is a case of there's no flaking, so you see a crack in the joint, but there is no separation of layers. It's just a sort of clean crack. Whereas here, this is a doubtful one. The enlargement I see now is not so clearly, but you can see here that there's some grain has gone missing, has been abraded. You see there's multiple smaller cracks here, but there's not actually flaking fragments like on this binding where you really saw there was a big part missing. So this is also very doubtful. When I see this as a whole, I would be very tempted to consider it a leather, but when you're actually looking at the flaking, I would have to say, well, maybe not really. So that's for all the difficulties, but luckily there were a lot of cases where it was quite clear whether the grain was flaking or not, or whether the upper layer was flaking or not, what the color of the cross section was, and how to characterize the fiber mass. So what you see in this diagram on the bottom, the S, the LG, and the J on the complete left, that's smooth, light gray to color, and yes, there's flaking. So you see all these three categories there, the combination of the three categories, so what I call the identification categories. And then there's the number of bindings, and then that belong to each one of those categories. And you see two sort of peaks in the diagram. The one is here on the left, which is smooth, light gray, and there's no flaking, and maybe add the four to the right of it, which have a doubtfully smooth fiber mass, but which have a light gray color and there's no flaking. And I would say those ones I would assess as a parchment bindings, parchment shagreen, parchment-like shagreen. And then on the right-hand side in the diagram, we have two peaks that I would consider leather. So that's the fibrous fiber mass with a brown or a red-brown color of the cross-section. And yes, there is actually a flaking upper layer. So it is, I think, despite all these 1s, 2s, and then there's a 1, 7 there, which have like a combination of properties which don't make them very easily identifiable as either a leather or a parchment. I think we can establish here that there's a large part of these bindings are bound in a shagreen, which I would consider a parchment-like shagreen, and then a smaller part of those bindings are bound in a shagreen, which I would consider a leather-like material, a leather-like shagreen. We leave those results for a minute, and then we'll go to the microscopical identification. So, and that's mostly based on the presumption and the knowledge, actually, that we distinguish between leather and parchment, not because of tannage, but because parchment is a skin material that was conserved by leaving it to dry under tension. And leather has not been dried under tension. So in leather, when adding the tannins, the actual three-dimensional orientation of the fibers is being conserved, whereas with shagreen, whereas with parchment, the skin is tensioned, and then the collagen fibers, they can't really shrink and get closer to one another, so they are actually pulled apart, or they're pulled lengthwise, and they're sort of coming in close together and sticking together, and which creates a bit of a layered structure, and like the fibers being oriented in a parallel manner next to one another. This has been very clearly explained by Ronald Reed in his Ancient Skins, Parchments and Leather. I'm sure you will know that publication, and if you don't, I would advise you to get it as soon as possible. The second one is just really nice because it has, that's John Arthur Wilson. It has about 200 plus images of all kinds of hide materials in cross section. So it's great. Salmon skin, ray skin, horse butt, calf, anything, name it, it's there. So if you ever want to work with cross section, you would have to get that book. So then the microscopical identification, here is what I said. So leather, you would see a more three-dimensional orientation of the fibers, and in parchment you will get a more two-dimensional orientation with a more layered structure, fibers laying more or less parallel next to one another. My method of working was I sampled all 85 book bindings that I had also visually or macroscopically assessed. I took little samples, triangular shaped samples of 2 by 1 millimeter. Mostly I could take them, as you can see here, underneath, parts of the paste down had been detached, so I could take it from the turn-in so it wouldn't be so disturbing, or I would take it from damaged areas. These little samples were embedded in an embedding liquid, which was good to use on a microtome, so I could actually slice it afterwards and then mount these little slices on microscopic slides, and I viewed them in transmitted light, and I viewed them 3 times, and all 3 times in just completely random order to make sure that I wasn't recognizing particular samples, because certain samples have particular shapes that, if you look at it that much, you will remember, oh, this is the one I looked at, and then I thought it was a parchment because it has this layered structure. So I want to be fresh, let's say, each time, and then to combine the 3 viewings. So if all of them 3 times I had said parchment, then okay, it is a parchment. But if there was one doubt, then I couldn't definitely say, okay, this was a parchment sample. So to give you the ideal of what parchment should look like, this is a piece of parchment from Cowley's, which I bought in 2015, calf parchment, or vellum, as some might call it. You see a layered structure, it's somewhat transparent, and this is exactly something that you see in this perfect shagreen from a binding from the National Library of the Netherlands. So you see the colored surface, and you see this transparent layer underneath, which has the typical parallels fiber structure, splitting a little bit between the fibers. So this, without a doubt, microscopically identifying, I said this is a parchment-like shagreen, and that also coincides with me when I visually examined the binding. I said it's a smooth fiber mass, or compact. It has a light gray color underneath, and there's no flaking. Then the ideal image of leather is this. This is a 18th century gilt leather. So you see there's like the fibers are running more up and down, and you also clearly see that some fibers are like cut not only along their length but across their length. And that's something that you see in this shagreen, which I identified all 3 times in a microscopical analysis as leather. So these are the ideals, you know. And then I also said when I looked at the binding that the material's fiber mass was fibrous, that it had a red-brown color, and that there actually was a flaking of a grain or upper layer. So that's the perfect examples. Then, of course, I had some which were not so perfect. So this one, which if I look at this sample again now, I would say it's parchment. But apparently the first of the 3 times I look at it, I said, well, I'm not so sure. I'm doubting a little bit, maybe because it was quite dark, or maybe because at the left bottom end you see some fiber sticking out that gives it some sort of fibrous 3-dimensional impression. So yeah, I couldn't say that this was for definite a parchment. And then this one, which was very, very thin. So that's why it also has this more reddish color, which sort of triggers your mind and you start thinking of leather. So that's what I thought of apparently, but because it also has this layered structure, I didn't want to say it was leather, but I also didn't want to say it was parchment. So all 3 times I was unsure what to call this. And then the final example is this one here, where I first apparently was very sure that it was really a leather. You see that there's fibers coming towards us that have been cut across their length, but you also see this sort of layered structure on top that apparently made me doubt at the end whether it was really a leather. Yeah, so this goes to show that even though when you read the description by Ronald Reed, how to distinguish leather and parchment, that actually there's a lot of hide materials that have been so much treated that it's maybe not so easy to identify them by looking at their cross section. Having said that, I think there were some important conclusions to draw. So we'll go back first to the diagram of my macroscopical observations. So here again, we look at the distribution of what I call the identification categories. So the combined, each category is a specific combination of the 3 properties: the fiber mass, the color of the fiber mass, and the presence or absence of flaking. And we said we had the parchment on the left and the leather on the right, and then we had a few dubious examples across the diagram, spread across the diagram. So when we look at the next diagram, we actually see that on the left-hand side, well, first of all, it is important to say that the green, the hybrid, so the ones that I couldn't say 3 times in a row for sure it's leather or it's parchment, they are spread all over the diagram. But what we do see is that on the left, which macroscopically, so visually, we said, okay, this is a parchment-like shagreen, that there is only blue, so only samples that microscopically I said they're a parchment, or there's the hybrid ones. And on the right-hand side, where we have seen the leather before, again, we only see samples that I have identified microscopically only as leather or hybrid ones. So the extremes, they seem to be there. The perfect examples, they seem to be there plenty, but there is this sort of gray area of material, of skin material that has been treated in such a way that also microscopically it's not so easy to sort of pinpoint whether it's a parchment or a leather, unfortunately. But I think this is reality in many, many situations. So I don't consider it a big problem. Then I reached nearly the end of the presentation, so we will get together all the information I gave to you and try and bring them to you into conclusive slides, or to slides with conclusions. I think the first conclusions, which are mainly based on the historical literature or on literature, is that, as I said before, shagreen is the most common name. So I would stick with using the name shagreen and just forget all about shark skin, or in Dutch they use shark skin and then put it in between quotation marks or well, I don't know the English word, sorry, but you know, to show we know it's not shark skin, but we still call it shark skin. Well, this is nonsense. There's no need for it. Um, Largely, we can distinguish two different origins. There is the equine type, which is made in the Caspian Sea region, that I would say it's always a sort of parchment-like material, because we have seen that it has been stretched and then left to dry, and the change of the skin that happens when you leave it to dry under tension, it is largely irreversible. But then on the other hand, we have this sort of, let's say, imitation shagreen that was made in Europe, that seems to be made mostly from goat leather, but I have found some mentions that it was also made of parchment, and I have seen examples of parchment as well. We can add to these things in literature that the irregular and the fan-shaped pattern are two distinct differences, but the irregular pattern can both be found on the equine type from the Caspian Sea region and on the imitation shagreen from Europe. The fan shape, I would say you would only find it on the imitation shagreen, because I don't see how you put seeds on the skin, you know, seeds, sort of round seeds, but not perfectly round, and you just spread them on there and then you get this regular fan shaped pattern. That just doesn't happen. And another interesting sort of sidetrack thing is I had a few samples analyzed with peptide mass fingerprinting by Dan Kirby, and instead of goat he found sheep. So this would be something to look at more deeply maybe at some point, is that a lot of what we consider Marocain, Cordouan, so we think about goat, might actually be a type of sheep. So a lot of the Morocco bindings, who knows, they are actually sheepskin bindings, but like a very good quality sheepskin. This is completely off topic, sorry. And the final thing is that these parchment-like, as I said before, these parchment-like properties, they have been confirmed and attested to in a lot of the descriptions of the bookbinding trade. So that was, you know, that's important to establish these things, I think. And then looking at the second part of the research, the microscopical and macroscopical assessment of the bindings, I think what we can conclude is that as a whole, the distinction that we can make microscopically between leather and parchment-like shagreen, it corresponds with that same distinction that we make when we visually assess the bindings. But unfortunately, it's not like a one-on-one success, or not 100% success rate, let's say. So we had this hybrid group, and that just goes to show how a hide material, when it's treated in certain ways during production, or when it is applied, or when it has aged, that it can take on slightly different properties, or it looks slightly different. So you always have to be a little bit cautious when you're looking at a bookbinding with a hide material and a pebbled granular surface. You have to be cautious. Is this a parchment or a leather? But you can really trust your own visual assessment, and I think that's very important. A very important conclusion. So I want to thank you for your attention, and before saying the really last words and going on to the Q&A, I want to say that those of you who would ever be in the Netherlands and would be interested in having a closer look at my research, both collections have a set of samples, of cross-section samples that I took from the bindings. I also have a copy of my master thesis in the collection, so you can actually go there and study them, which I found important because I was sampling these bindings. So you take something of the binding, and I found it like important to give something back to the collections. So I want to thank you all, and I want to thank particularly those 4 people who were helping me during most of my research, and there were many others who helped me also to a certain extent. And then I would like to give the floor to you for your questions, and I will try and answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Herre. That was a really interesting presentation and really informative. We have a few questions already.
That's great.
Yeah, so from Amélie, she's asked, how did you procure the skin when you were making your own?
Yeah, I just found a horse butchers, and I well, first I found a few horse butchers online, so they are a particular type of butchers. And then of one of those butchers, I found that he was giving away the legs to the blacksmiths to practice, the people to practice the putting on the how do you call it, like the metal shoes for the horses.
Horseshoes.
Yeah. So I found them and I said, "Can I buy skins of you?" And he said, "Yeah, that's fine, 15 euros a piece." So I bought two, and I went there and they gave it to me. I don't know if that stays that easy. Would be nice because of health and safety, hygiene reasons. It might be changing, but it was fairly easy.
Interesting. I wouldn't have thought you could just go there and ask for it, but you never know when you don't ask. We've got another question as well from Anjali, and she said, "Thank you for your presentation." She's asking for clarification on the bar chart for macroscopical characteristics. What did the X stand for?
The B, yeah, anywhere where there's an X written is that the shagreen was in such a good condition that I couldn't establish it. So for instance, if you have a binding which is in perfect condition and there's no cracks anywhere, and you also can't lift the paste downs to have a look at the sides of the turn-ins, you can't really see what the cross section is. So any X would mean that I wasn't able to find an answer to the property I was looking for. And so if there's an XXB, then it's it should probably be an XBX. Then it's a brown with no, well, never mind. Anyway, I hope this clarifies. And if it doesn't clarify enough, please ask again.
Great. I actually had a question as well. And aside from the using microscopy to look at the skins, is there any other analytical techniques to distinguish, like what might be a parchment versus leather?
Well, not really, because, well, the way I understand the difference, and I'm following there with conviction what Ronald Breed says, is that the real difference between the two materials arises from their either drying under tension, which is a parchment, or like conserving the three-dimensional natural orientation of the fibers. And that mostly is being done by tanning a hide, but a lot of parchments historically have been also tanned. So the presence of tannins is not exclusive to leather. And when you read Ronald Reed more properly, which I did a second time round when it didn't appear to be so easy, he also says that he looked at a lot of the scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he said, yeah, many samples of them, it's very difficult to distinguish between one or the other because it's just the material has changed over time. So I think, for instance, a leather that when you apply it, you stretch it heavily, it also starts to look differently. And then when it's pressed, when it's drying, it also looks differently. So that's when you get all these sort of confusing microscopical images. Okay. Then again, I also think those actions also change the properties of the material a little bit. So a leather, obviously, that's being stretched heavily might also want to shrink much more. So.
Great. Oh, we've got a whole bunch of other questions that have suddenly come in. So Angela Kraft had a similar question and she said, okay, it's just answered, thank you. There was, Amanda's asking, I didn't catch the name of the material you spread on the skin to tan it. I believe it was some kind of powder.
Yeah, it was gallnut powder. So it's like from the gallnut, from the Aleppo
like
oak or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then someone else has asked, can we call ray skin the shagreen leather?
Not really, because a ray skin or a shark skin can be both a leather and a parchment as well. For instance, here I have a ray skin, and the way it looks, I think you will understand, and maybe you can hear it. This is a parchment. This is a ray skin that was dried under tension. And you also have ray skins which have actually been tensed and tanned and which are much more flexible. So also with ray and shark skin, you really have to look at what are the properties to understand how they were produced and how they might thus react when you start working with them and treating them.
Great. All right, I think that's all the time we have for today, but thank you again so much for the presentation. I'm just gonna let
You're
you guys
welcome.
know what the next presentation is. So the next talk in the series will be hosted by the ICON Modern Materials Network, and this will be next week on Monday, June the 8th at 4 p.m. British Summer Time. And we'll be joined by Louise Dennis, the curator of the Museum of Design and Plastics at Arts University Bournemouth, with her talk, An Introduction to MODIP, and a look at museological relationships with plastics. So we'll look forward to seeing you there. And thank you again, Herre, that was great. If anyone has any questions, please do email him with the rest of them. All right, have a good day.
Bye-bye.